Welcome to Stranger Things in the 1980s. My name is Vince Locke. I am your host. In this podcast, my guests and I take deep dives into the Upside Down, where we analyze each episode of the Netflix series, along with related movies and books, and examine them in the context of 1980s America. Welcome back to Stranger Things of the 1980s. For this episode, I'm joined by a couple friends and colleagues and fellow strangers. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourselves and tell our listeners who you are and what you do?
Well, I'm Mike Evans. I am an assistant professor at Delta College in the history department. My specialism is actually medieval Europe, but I have a keen interest in modern popular cultural history. So I love the references and so on that we see in Stranger Things to the culture of a period when really I was growing up. I was a teenager for most of the 80s.
And I'm Kenlea Pebbles. Hopefully by the time this podcast is out, I will be Dr. Pebbles. I'm currently at Michigan State University in writing rhetoric and American cultures. And I am also very fond of this time period because I am also a child of the 80s, 70s and 80s, just like my partner in crime here, Mike. And so that to me is something near and dear to my heart and my experiences in life, as well as this particular episode. Being a latchkey kid, I was always a latchkey kid. So yeah, I remember coming home even from kindergarten as a latchkey kid.
First of all, welcome, guys. I'm really happy to have you here. I especially wanted to get Mike's perspective on both the show and just sort of 1980s culture as someone who didn't grow up in the U.S. So did the U.S. in the 80s seem as crazy as I think it did?
It was the Reagan era, it was the Thatcher era for us. So in some ways they were parallel to each other. But I think America is always further down the road of craziness. Apologies to America and its wonderful people. American conservatism is more extreme than British conservatism. I think there's a greater link between the right and the evangelical Christian movement in this country than there is in European countries. So, yeah, if you want to know what Britain's going to be like in 10 years' time, look at what the United States is now. That's usually a good rule of thumb.
We saw that with college funding and everything else. Yeah.
So pretty much confirming what I thought. Okay, so welcome, guys. Now, Kenlea, you were sort of segueing into our topic for today, which is latchkey kids. So you want to go ahead and talk about that? What were latchkey kids? Why was it such an issue in the 1980s?
It's one of those things that's interesting because my dad and my Aunt Barb, were latchkey kids, but that was back in the 1940s and 1950s. And they didn't have a term for kids like that because you were growing up basically working poor. So they were raised by a single mom. So that was one of the things that was just kind of like a given. And the thing that happened in the 1970s and 1980s is we actually got a name.
Yes.
Because we became much more widespread. So at that point in time, about 50% of women started working outside the home. And in my case, which Vince, we had just talked a little bit earlier, that, my family history is that both my grandmothers worked. I come from a family of working women. My mother worked. She actually worked a job where she was on call. And so I remember as a child, my dad was a police officer in Detroit. My mom worked at Mishcon down in Detroit, downtown Detroit. And I remember every time when the phone would ring in the middle of the night, my parents would be like, I hope it's for you. So it was one of those things where that was the childhood I had. I had one of our neighbors, their mom worked. My neighbor Mindy, her mom worked. And then my neighbor Mark, his mom was a stay-at-home mom. So you really saw a division of that. Your mom was a stay-at-home mom, Mike.
Yeah, my experience was very different from Kenlea's because I was far more in the traditional nuclear family. It was literally mother, father, two kids. So almost exactly the stereotype. And the area I grew up in was a fairly prosperous area, always voted conservative, a mixture of farming, small town with some industry, and the commuter belt for Manchester. If you go a little further to the east and north, you get to really the Manchester United soccer players, stereotypical, fabulously wealthy Cheshire commuter belt area for Manchester.
Yeah, whereas I grew up in Detroit and then Ferndale, Madison Heights for a little bit. And so for us, it was like my parents were both finishing college while my brother and I were growing up. My dad actually started college after my brother was born. And so it was one of those things where our parents were coming from working class and trying to get college educations and be first generation in college as we were growing up. And we kind of lived that experience in that life of really trying to move into the middle class. That was part of my life. My brother was 6 years older. So actually, I remember in kindergarten, Mrs. Hall used to watch me for the afternoon. And when my brother got home, and I would then come home and my brother would start prepping dinner for my mom, and I would do the dishes from the breakfast. So I remember pulling out the chair at 5 years old. I was 4 and 5 from kindergarten and like doing the dishes. And so we had our set chores to do as soon as we got home. And as I got older, I had my list. My mother always made sure I was very involved with activities to make sure that, no wild, crazy things happened after school for those unmonitored, like 3 hours to 4 hours after school once you would get home from work. Yeah. So I think that was a very common thing at that point in time. About like it literally was about half my friends growing up.
Mm-hmm.
We all, you had a 50-50 chance. Do you have parents when you come home? Do you not have parents when you come home? But that's why they named us Latchkey Kids, because we literally I remember having a string with a key on it around my neck when I was really young to come home with. So that would be like part of it. You just come home, you have to pull out your key, let yourself in, and the house was yours.
Yeah. I was going to ask you if you could define for our listeners what a latchkey kid was, but yeah, that's what it comes down to. It is basically, kids who kind of had to watch out for themselves and take care for themselves or their siblings because their parents had to work.
It's the experience of Will and Jonathan for sure. And I look at that one and I'm like, I know that world. And, as we know, the very first episode when Jonathan ended up working, because he's substantially older than Will, very much like my brother and I. And Jonathan's at work and he's like, well, I got extra hours. So I went to work, and that meant Will was home alone.
Yes.
And that was not an unusual occurrence at all during that time period. That's why we had it's 10 o'clock at night. Do you know where your child is? Because it was an announcement that was made at 10 o'clock and all the major stations. There's memes about it. There's all sorts of jokes about it online. And it's a very real thing. And it was, a lot of us grew up like if our parents were home then and not working in like an evening shift or a night shift, that it was one of those things where, it was kind of like reminding us, you better have your kids home. The street lights are off. Street lights are on. Sorry. Street lights are on. It's dark. Make sure your kids are at home. And
that was kind of the common experience too, is, as a kid in the 80s, you would go off with your friends or whatever. And the rule was you had to be at home when the street lights came on.
Yeah. Yeah. That was a very real thing. And a lot of times, you would have friends maybe who had a stay-at-home mom, but they needed to clean or do something for whatever. And they'd be like, get out of the house.
Yeah. Yeah. I wasn't technically a latchkey kid because, my parents were at home, But most of my friends were latchkey kids, and at one point, my mom was caring for some of my friends who were latchkey kids. So
You had the neighborhood watch, right? Where it's like you had people watching out for those kids.
right. Now, you had mentioned that it was beginning in the 1970s. This is when we first had a name for these kind of kids. This is where the latchkey kid enters into our lexicon.
Oh, so if I could jump in, I looked this up online. It's on Wikipedia, so it must be true.
Uh-huh.
Apparently the term was invented in the 1940s in the context of women working in the factories and men being away with the military.
Yes.
But it's only in the 1970s that it gets attached to this kind of moral panic,
Yes.
which I think this was an era of a lot of moral panics, the 1980s. And one of the ironies, I think, is that often the same people who were wringing their hands about children being unsupervised at home were nostalgic for the days when they were kids, and we didn't watch TV. We went out and played, and we didn't come back until it was dark, and that was great. That was healthy, and so unsupervised children are great when there's a parent at home, two parents at home waiting for them, but not great when they're home alone, which is kind of paradoxical. But
Yes.
I think it reflects the backlash era of the 80s, the backlash against the progressive gains of the 1960s and 70s.
Mhm.
And the idea of the latchkey kid is attached to the idea that the mother is no longer at home.
Yes.
Two parents are now often working. And so it was part of the attack on the kind of new family that was supposedly replacing the traditional nuclear family. The Thatcher government in Britain was very concerned about the family. It was very central to their ideology of turning back the clock to pre-1960s Britain.
Mhm.
Margaret Thatcher once said, "There's no such thing as society. There are only individuals and families." The
Interesting.
notorious Section 28, which was an anti-LGBT legislation, described families with LGBT parents as, quotes, pretended family units. So the family was seen as under attack, and the latchkey kids concept is part of that fear that the family is breaking
Yes.
down.
Yeah,
Yes.
but it's the exact same thing. This is why I was mentioning my father and my aunt, right? Was because in the 1940s, 1950s, these things did happen, especially like in the situation of my Nana. She was a single parent from, my time my dad was 4, my Aunt Barb was 1. And because, her husband died, you have this concept, and false concept, that women didn't work, that women should
Mhm.
be home, and that this was something that really emerged after World War II, where women were basically being forced. So my Nana was actually a laundress, and she did laundry for people, and she was a waitress. And so when you have this kind of situation where it's like, kind of forcing women to be at home, you're going to make it very difficult for them to
Mhm.
work. I think too, is like in my brain, it was a big deal when my mom had more choices available to her. She didn't have to have her husband allow her to get an account
Mhm.
for her own paycheck. And this concept, that is not something that is as old as people seem to think that is. That's the 1970s. That is
Right.
my childhood. Where women finally had that ability, if you were married, to create your own account
Yeah.
without your husband's permission. And so when you have women being able to make these choices, then you had an increase in divorce.
Yes.
You had women who were able to make their own choices, make their own way. They weren't as dependent on their husbands. And I think that fueled part of this panic.
Yes.
And, how dare women become independent? And, if they have a partner that is not a good match for them, or abusive, or anything else, any reason that the relationship isn't functioning well, that
Mhm.
society goes into a panic. And then
Yes.
you have but this isn't a real family, and this is a real family. Exactly what you were talking about, Mike. And it's like, that's where you have people panicking, and then they start going, oh, now we have to worry about the children. And it's like, you didn't have to worry about the children back in the 40s and 50s. Like, but now you do, because women are becoming independent.
Yeah.
So, and that to me is like a huge part of it. And I think that's where you see again those parallels that you see between the US and the UK.
I remember when I was a kid, and I've talked about this before, how my parents were like news junkies. The 6 o'clock news, the 11 o'clock news, the morning news, it was always on. And very frequently you would have these stories on the news about the problem of latchkeyism and latchkey kids. What are we going to do about it? So there was that sense that there was a moral panic regarding this situation, and it was directed specifically at women.
Yeah, because that's just too wild and crazy to have happy women.
Uppity women got to be put in place.
Yeah. And also in the 1960s, the pill made women more able to control their own reproduction. And part of the backlash in any era, not just then, but also now, is also against women's reproductive rights.
Yes. Yeah, it's all connected. Yeah. How has this idea of the problem of latchkey kids, how has it helped shape our world today? I think you just alluded to it a little bit, Mike.
Well, I just to reinforce the fact that I think we're in another backlash era right now, and the sort of moral panic currently is against transgender people.
Mm-hmm.
So we have the ridiculous situation where there's bans on drag. Drag is as old as people have been on the stage, at least as old as Shakespeare, as old as Greek drama.
Yes.
That's funny.
So I think how it influences today is that the backlash always focuses on the family and the traditional family unit and perceived threats to that. And the idea of panicking people about, to quote The Simpsons, "Won't somebody please think of the children," is always at the center of these backlashes. So, for example, the backlash against trans people is centered on gender-neutral bathrooms, and will a man pretending to be woman come in and molest your children, even though there've never been armed guards on bathrooms asking people to prove their gender until now. So the family unit and the fear of the disruption of the family unit is, I think, always central to these moral panics.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's the idea that, if we allow this to happen, then it's going to lead to some sort of social catastrophe, or society's going to crumble. Now, Kenlea, you're a parent. So do you think being a latchkey kid influenced your parenting?
Yeah, totally. I think, my mom had it spot on, but I think she learned this from her mom, that kids need to be busy and they need to have activities. So I think this is really important with my kids, was that they had to work to help put themselves through school. They also had to have activities after school. And while I often had to work when they got home, it was a very, very important thing that they had their chores. They had their list of responsibilities, whether it be like, I have to go to swim class, or I have, marching band practice, or whatever it was after school. I knew what they were doing. I know what they should be doing, what had to be done before I got home. And that was keeping that structure functioning for them after school. So I think being a latchkey kid, that was something that was important for me. You get like a certain amount of playtime, but you need to get the other things done. Mm-hmm. You always had the phone numbers. The neighbors knew where I was and where I was working on what days, in case they had to contact me. And that was just like, a standard fare of what I had learned. And I was a single parent at the time. Mike was not part of the picture. So that to me was absolutely essential as a parent, to know what my kids were doing, what days, what they knew what their chores were. Mm-hmm. We had a board as soon as it came in the house with the schedule on it. So the kids always knew what was coming, so they could look at it in the morning before they got on the bus. Mm-hmm. All of those things. So running it, I think, like a well-oiled machine was always my goal.
Yeah, because I think one of the effects of that latchkey attitude or mindset is that it fostered independence and responsibility, because mm-hmm. you had to do these things in order for your household just to function. And I
Absolutely.
wonder if there has been a sort of backlash against that society-wise in terms of the way people raise their kids now, or it seems like kids now are much more supervised than we were. We get that idea of the helicopter parent, for example.
Yeah, exactly. I remember once attending a training when I worked at a different college as an advisor about how to deal with millennials, essentially. It wasn't called that, but that was the implication. And the speaker talked about the different generations, and obviously this is very broad brush and stereotypical, but our generation were defined as the independent generation. And by our generation, I mean Gen Xers, essentially. Yes. Whereas millennials were described as, I think the exact description in the training was the wanted, beloved child, or something like that. So you see the swing from the concept of the latchkey child who just gets on and does it themselves, doesn't need the supervision, to the child who's constantly watched over, monitored, protected, leading to the helicopter child, helicopter parent concept. If people aren't familiar with the term helicopter parent, it's a parent who's always hovering there, never out of sight.
And I think it's interesting because I had my kids really early. And so my kids are millennials. So I'm a Gen Xer with millennial kids. And so typically most of the parents were boomers.
Yeah.
And that was always really interesting because, I would occasionally get comments about that. And sometimes my kids would be like, oh, why can't you be like so-and-so's mom? But it was great when they got older, and then their friends were like, your mom's so cool. I love your mom. And, we were like the household that I didn't care if a kid came and crashed on our couch. It was one of those things where it was, we were the safe house. And so we were the house where a lot of the queer kids, when they got kicked out of their homes, like they came and crashed on our couch. And we were, always like, no problem. Like, you're safe here and you have a safe place to be and sleep away, and we'll do what we can to help you. And, so we ended up being that house. So like everybody thought we were, like, before you came along, I was super cool. And then you came along, and then we are super cool, because these kids would be like, I wish my parents were like your parents. And I think that was because of that my kids grew up, I think, differently than a lot of their classmates. Even though like their classmates often had 2-parent working households, it was structured differently, where the mom made more sacrifices. Whereas like in my kid's case, it's just me. So like there's only so many sacrifices that could be made.
Right.
Because it's one person. So I think that was how I saw it emerging. But my kids, they went through with like very, very few hiccups. I mean, I raised 2 really good kids, but man, again, I will say it was a well-oiled machine. Things had to be organized.
Okay, so that takes us into Stranger Things. This time we're looking at Chapter 7, which is The Lost Sister, although I would argue it should have been Chapter 8 instead, because it deals with the character of 8. So I think they missed an opportunity there. But what do you think about this episode?
I actually, when I first watched it, I was like, this is kind of weird. This is like, I want to know what's happening in Hawkins.
Yeah.
The mind flare and the trap that was set. And they left us there, and then they went off. But it was like, again, I think it's spectacular. I mentioned earlier that, when we were watching this, and the way the song that ends the song is, in my brain, the perfect song for this, because it is a segue where you have 11 going off and she's finding herself, and it is just this separate story, but yet connected, right?
Yes.
And
this is more of a self-contained story for this particular season.
Yeah. And I think the episode for me was about finding family. One thing that we emphasized, that was talked about a lot as Gen Xers became adults in the 1990s, was making your own families, making
Yes.
your connections with your friends and associates. If you don't have a great family life, well, you can make your own family. And number 8 and her companions have done that, and that is a possible family for 11 to join.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And I think it shows the non-traditional family, right? It shows like the families that can be made, non-traditional families. It's a diverse and inclusive family. And I think it really shows what I think so many of us in Gen X really depended on is, again, I mentioned, like, we had our neighbors that watched out for us, that we always had this like larger connection, this larger network of relationships that were really important for us.
Yes. So, I mean, we are cheating a little bit here in the sense that the episode isn't about latchkey kids so much as it is about runaways. But I think there is many of the same ideas between the two.
Lack of supervision is one of them.
Yes.
And independence.
Yes. And forming those bonds and connections between individuals and putting together their sort of own family. Yes. So when this season first premiered, people hated this episode because they found it to be really disruptive, which I understand, because we've been following this serialized story through the rest of the season with what's going on in Hawkins. And then the episode before this one ends on a cliffhanger with the Hawkins lab under attack. And suddenly the brakes are put on and we follow 11 instead. And so it is a more self-contained episode, but it's an episode that I really like because I think it is a really good story in itself.
I agree. I think sometimes it actually helps to disrupt that pace of the storytelling a little and step back. And also it makes Elle's return less of a Deus Ex Machina moment. You have backstory now to Elle and how she's really exploring her powers with Carly in Chicago. And it's also interesting that the city versus small town. Hawkins is the traditional American small town, whereas Chicago is a big conurbation, and the city is shown not as entirely threatening. There are people in the city who are working and looking out for one another.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think, as I said, like the first time I watched it, it felt disruptive. And the second time I watched it, I really actually enjoyed it so much more. And I think it is, again, that essential point of coming of age and making a crucial decision for Elle that is at the heart of this, is like figuring out who I am. And that leads to this decision that she makes at the end of the episode.
Yes. I think it's a necessary part of the story. Which I don't think perhaps you necessarily appreciate the first time seeing it, but if you look at the scope of the entire story for the season and look back on it, then you say, okay, I see where this comes in, why it's important. So I think of this as like the Empire Strikes Back episode.
And it's also important to understand too, this is not like a traditional serial TV show too. They really did design this to be like a book.
Yes.
And this is exactly what a book would do.
Yes.
And I think that for me is like part of what threw me that very first time I watched it was like, I did not expect that from a TV structure. I expect that from a book structure, but not TV. And I think that was one of the things I had to adjust to myself when I watched it the second time, because I am a huge fan of the show. How many times have I watched this? About 5, 6?
4th or 5th.
I think that's about 6th time for me.
Yeah.
So
yes, we're currently rewatching the whole thing. We were originally going to say we'll rewatch this episode so it's fresh in our minds. Then we went back, something from the beginning. We're now at season 4, and season 4 you see far more of Elle's history and the children in the lab. And I think 2-7, the episode we're discussing today, actually helps relate back to that or forwards to that we're seeing. Elle not as an individual, but as part of a really dysfunctional community, but a kind of a community under Brenner in the lab.
And I do see some things in this episode that I think were intentional foreshadowing for season 4. Now, the title, The Lost Sister, most of the episode titles have multiple meanings. So what do you think is the meaning of the title here?
I mean, you have the literal one where it's like they grew up together in the lab, right? You have 8 and 11, and they are getting, Mama is giving her the flashback, Jane 11/11, Jane/11. This concept of like, here you are playing with this young girl. She's your sister. She's your family. Go to her, which is what Jane's like, 11's like, hey, I need to go find her because I think Mama wants me to find her because she is my family. And I think you have that literal one, right, where she's trying to find her. She can't locate her at first, and then she finally locates her and goes to her. And then you even have 8 talking about like, I feel whole now. I feel like a part of me is missing, whole now. And so even with the makeshift family, is like she missed Elle. And you have that literal part of it. But I think there's some more things deeper.
Yes.
Well, I mean, one double meaning might be which sister is lost.
Exactly.
Is Elle looking for her lost sister, or is Callie finding her lost sister and welcoming her into the community?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question, is who is the lost sister? Because I think at the surface level, we're meant to see it as being Callie. That is the sister that 11 is missing and is looking for. But does it apply to 11?
Absolutely. And as I mentioned before, that this is a really important episode for Elle to figure out who she is.
Yes.
And
she finds herself.
Yeah. And to find yourself. And I think at the end, and listening to the actress who plays 8, that she's reconsidering her own position at the end of this particular episode and her own approach after Elle makes her decision based after she's finding who she is.
Yes.
And then makes a decision. And it causes 8 to reconsider things. And so I think that is something that's really important. And I think you're absolutely right. I'm just going to toss in here. I love that on the bus, it is very much a retro fabric. But it has a rainbow in it. I'm just going to toss that out, that there's this beautiful rainbow line in the fabric on the bus. So I think you're absolutely right that this is like foreshadowing a lot of things that are coming. It is foreshadowing the past that they share together.
Yeah.
I guess past shadowing.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we have, definitely some things that are going to be unfolding that are alluded to in this particular episode that are going to be very important later.
Yes.
Yeah. When I watch this episode, I'm always reminded a little of Orphan Black. If anyone listening has not seen that, I think Stranger Things fans would love Orphan Black as well. That's also about sisterhood. It's also about invasive scientific interventions in children's lives. And I always think, particularly when they hug and say sister, I always think immediately of Orphan Black.
I'm just looking at my Orphan Black figures up here. So.
Okay.
Yeah, we have Funko Pop's Orphan Black figures in the room with us.
Yeah, but absolutely. I think, this show does a beautiful job at like pulling from like pop culture aspects that are within the context of the show and giving little tiny nods to it, not just of the 80s that are really important, but actually like current events as well.
That's one of the things I really love about the show is it's very much like a puzzle where you get all of these different pieces to not only reward viewers who pay attention, because these little pieces, little clues that are sort of in the background help you to gain a deeper understanding of the story, but also, like you say, it is revealing something about the 1980s and how that connects to our present time. Speaking of foreshadowing, this is the first time that we see Callie and her crew since the first episode of the season, because the first episode begins with them being chased by the police. And as a viewer, you're wondering, okay, who are these people? I'm not expecting to see them. I'm expecting to see our heroes in Hawkins. And then they disappear until chapter 7. So now we're told, okay, here's who they are. Here's why they're important.
Absolutely. And I think it's really interesting because I'm going to let you know, like, I find this episode interesting because I feel like the 1980s was filled with all sorts of runaway like storylines. You had your after school specials, all of these things. This is like a common theme. You listen to it in the music. You had all of the videos with runaways. And I think that is part of this. And I think, you know, in your brain too, that's part of the Empire Strikes Back. But you have, I think, with this family of Callie and Dottie and Axel and Nick and Funshine, and I have to say, Funshine just like warms my heart.
Yes.
That you just have this, you know, again, pulling that diversity that, you know, there are self-claimed misfits, and that they don't fit into their families as they were lost, that Callie brought them together.
Yeah. And they say that.
Yeah, they openly say that. And I think it's so important because I think that's so much of like what I think Gen Xers, we were really going through that because I think we're at that point in time, a very misunderstood generation. We were being attacked. I feel like as a generation, we were being attacked in so many ways through the news media and, you know,
they're just a bunch of slackers.
Yeah, it was very difficult.
It was the beginning of the parental advisory sticker, wasn't it? Which of course was reclaimed by NWA and made it into the Straight Outta Compton record cover.
And so to me, I always feel like, you know, I watch this and I'm like, I feel this. You feel this so almost personally.
Yes.
Because I think so many of us were kind of like, we were trying to find family in each other. And I think that was in part because, you know, so many of my boomer family members, which were the majority of my aunts and uncles, and then my parents were silent gen, right? And they didn't understand what it was like for us to grow up at that point in time. But, you know, we were at this very bizarre time period, I think, with the wall coming down, with all of these things that were happening that the boomers kind of took as their experiences that were not ours.
Right.
We had clear accidents. We had all of these things were happening. And I think what you see in Callie, Dottie, Axel, Mick, and Funshine is this push against Reaganism, this push against Thatcherism of what is a family, and this denial of like society and society's responsibilities and roles. And we see like we just saw this like defunding constantly in Gen X that continued on. I think so many of your listeners may not know why we were even named Gen X. The reason we're named Gen X is because we were the first generation that they already knew we were not going to live the same life as our parents did. We would not financially be at the same level. And so I think there was a sense of we have to find solidarity with each other.
Yeah. And I think the physical presence of Carly's group in the disused warehouse captures that kind of post-industrial feeling. It's when the old heavy industry was closed down, a process often accelerated by government policies deliberately. For example, in Britain, the industries were just sold off to the highest bidder and then often closed down. And so that sort of post-industrial urban space, I think, also captures the feel of the period.
Yeah, that's part of the reason I was talking about Flint too, right? Because to me, Flint was part of that same deindustrialization, and that was my experience. You know, going to school at University of Michigan Flint, just like you, Vince.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and I've talked about this before on the podcast. You know, I grew up in Flint and very much a lower working class background.
Absolutely. And you know, again, finding that solidarity with each other, because for me, I was in a situation at that same age where I had to move out of my parents' house because of my father's violence. And I found myself actually in the East Village in Flint, at an apartment with a friend of mine who I took psychology with. And there were a couple of us who were actually escaping violence that weekend, and were like crashing on the floor. And I think, to me, I look at this and it's like, that's why I'm saying this. To me, I look at that family unit that would not be considered a family unit. That is what I think so many of us really needed.
Yes.
And had to have at that point in time. And I think, to me, that's very personal, because I think so many of us were like that because society had let us down.
You had mentioned the music earlier, and for me, the music of this episode, I think is fitting, but for the most part, I feel like it's a little too much on the nose, because you get Bon Jovi's Runaway, which, okay, not very subtle, as 11 comes to Chicago and gets off the bus. We get the Runaways with their song Dead End Justice when they're gearing up to go find, I think Ray is his name. And those songs, I think, are pretty much very surface level. You can tell what they're about and how they relate to the story. But then, as you mentioned, Icicle Works during the end credits with Whisper to a Scream, or Birds Fly, as it's technically named. I think that one, I really like the way they use it in this particular episode, because I think it works in a way that is thematically relevant without being like really in your face about it the way the other songs are.
To me, I look at that song, and that's something that Mike and I kind of like share. He was surprised I knew the song.
Yeah, I was far more into indie music in the 80s than I was into the chart music. And as Kenlea said, this was my part of the world, northwest of England, where Icicle Works came from. And Whisper to a Scream nicely encapsulates Elle's development. It was the powers, but there might be other aspects we could see.
I think it's that, as I mentioned earlier, Vince, not on the podcast, but in private conversation, is that when this song from Icicle Works came out, I was reading the book called The Kestrel by Lloyd Alexander, and it was a coming of age story, very much like this particular chapter kind of comes out, and it's a part of a trilogy. And being a Lloyd Alexander fan, growing up reading his books, to me, that song very much encapsulated that process of coming of age, that you're trying to figure out who you are. You can say things softly, but you have this emergence of like finding your strength, and putting it out there in the world. But it's also finding the people that support you, which again is going back to that family unit, the people that will support you in finding yourself and who you are, and allowing you to develop that strength. And I think, again, for your listeners who are young adults, it is really important to go through that process, realizing and recognizing your strengths. And that's what Elle really goes through in this. And it's spectacular because she does not just the strength, but she finds like her skill strength, but she also finds her internal strength. And that, to me, is just part of the joy of this particular episode. And we see that with her decision at the end again of, what do I choose to value? And what will I do with this?
And this is part of the reason why I associate this with Empire Strikes Back. Because, as we've seen in the show previously, Star Wars is an important thematic element, specifically Empire Strikes Back, because that's when we're introduced to Yoda and Lando, who are referenced several times in the previous season. But also the story of Empire Strikes Back is that you have Luke Skywalker, who's the Jedi, the Force user, separates himself from the rest of the rebels, goes off in search of a Jedi Master to train him, has a vision of his friends in danger, and decides to leave his training in order to go rescue his friends. And it's like, there are so many parallels with what happens with 11 in this episode. She leaves to find someone with similar abilities who trains her how to use them. And then she has a vision of her friends in danger and decides to go and help them. So yeah, you're right. This is an important piece of her development as a character, but also as a person.
Yeah. And it's that value driven aspect of like, what are you going to choose to value? And I think, for me, like, I have to admit, I am much more of a Trekkie than I am an Empire Strikes Back or, Star Wars kind of person. I've always enjoyed the Star Wars stories, and that is very much of that time. But to me, I see, again, more of my personal background is like the X-Men, kind of like connecting it to that. But yeah, it's one of those things where I think absolutely you again have this side story with Luke figuring things out and having to make a judgment quite quickly and a decision quite quickly based on what they value.
Yes.
And what's important to them. And I think it's interesting because, Elle is at this point where it's like, you could become my family. And her friends back home have already become her family. She just didn't realize it and recognize it at that point in time, I think, to that level.
Yes. And Callie does tell her at the end that they can't care for you the way that we can. But 11 says, no, but I can help them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think the show generally has this tension between the unit and the other forces pulling them away. We see that developed with Mike in season 2, wanting things to stay the same when the others want to go beyond their D&D campaigns in their mom's basement and so on. And we're rewatching season 4, we see Lucas being pulled away from his friendship group by the popular crowd.
Yeah, and I think Dustin does that in season 3. And we really see that, too, like as we grow up and we find ourselves, it doesn't happen at the same time now, does it? And again, it's finding the people who will support you in that process. And I think to me, like exactly that, and I think that's what the Empire Strikes Back does. I really would always felt like, I would like more Princess Leia, kind of like coming of age. It always felt a little too male centric for me. I think that was always part of my issue with the series. With Star Wars, I always wanted a little more female centric. Currently they are doing a part of it that is more female centric, but the ones in the 80s were more male centric. But I think too, we also see that interesting aspect of male and female dynamics with the friend group, right? And Hopper. And I think, there are moments where you're kind of like a male toxicity, masculine toxicity issues. And you can see it emerging and how they navigate this, right? I think that's one of the things I really do enjoy with the show, because I think they deal with it so much more than what would have happened back in the 80s.
Yes.
Because again, this current influence of like, that would not fly now. But, it's the masculine toxicity is definitely something they acknowledge and give a nod to. But to me, again, I'm going to go back. I see a lot of X-Men in this particular episode. And that is one of the things I really enjoy.
Yeah, and the idea of how do you use your powers is very central to the X-Men canon.
Yes.
Are you Magneto or are you Xavier? And lots of us feel that Magneto is a very sympathetic character, has good reason to act the way he does.
I was going to transition into talking about X-Men because, there is that strong Star Wars influence. Except Callie isn't so much a Yoda as she is a Darth Vader. But going back to the X-Men, we talked about this a little bit in our X-Men episode in our first season. What's the connections there?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, her ability is so much like Mastermind.
Yes. So Callie's power, being able to project images into people's minds. We see this in X-Men, specifically in the Dark Phoenix saga, in the character of Mastermind.
Absolutely. And, I just personally love, again, the X-Men discussion of like, and it's like this coming of age. Again, coming of age. The characters are coming of age all the time in X-Men, as you have like the younger X-Men coming up, learning from the older X-Men, but you also had like the very beginning group, thinking Dark Phoenix, Jean Grey. You have this whole process of like, you have the ones who start out as teenagers in Xavier's school, but they go through this process. And so many times these kids are themselves also runaways.
Yes.
And they are struggling with society and, you know, questioning whether they themselves are monsters, which we very much see Elle struggling with, but also particularly in, you know, season 4
Mhm.
of, am I good or am I bad? And it's like the question is sometimes often in between. We are often not black or white. We are gray.
Mhm.
And I think we really see that in this episode, the grayness, which I think X-Men do so well. You know, it's in my brain.
Absolutely.
I love how they
Yeah.
handle the gray. That just going Jean Grey. That we have this, like, we're not all good, we're not all bad. We all have to make decisions
Yeah.
on how do we use our powers and when do we use them and how, you know, we can't foresee how the end results are going to turn out. So those decisions are not always easy to make.
And we talked before about how 11 is very similar to Jean Grey and the Dark Phoenix saga, how that gets represented in the first season. But of course, when you get to season 4, you get the Hellfire Club, which is an integral part of that storyline. So yeah, the X-Men connection is very deliberately being made there.
Absolutely. You read comics.
Yeah.
And then Callie's power, yeah, it is paralleled in X-Men. It's also paralleled in Firestarter, which we have talked about in a previous episode. Andy McGee, Charlie McGee's father, has the same ability, right? And we do see the connections or the similarities between 11 and Charlie in Firestarter as well. So it's all connected again.
Again, yeah, very much connected. And I think it's always like, again, I think this is like, for those of us who don't have superpowers, that we have to make decisions in life and use our skills and our abilities to the best that we can. And how do we do that? How do we go through that process of making those choices and decisions of coming of age?
Yes.
Right.
And of course, these, you know, stories of people with superpowers, X-Men or Star Wars, whatever, often, you know, science fiction like that is a metaphor for what is currently happening. And so it becomes easier to see how a character that is fictionalized in that way deals with a situation so that we can deal with it ourselves in a more believable way or realistic way.
Absolutely.
I do find it interesting on the superhero theme that the one character explicitly called a superhero is Bob, who is on the face of it the least heroic. He's just a regular guy.
Yes.
And in the unlikely event no one's seen episode 8 of season 2 yet, I will not tell you what becomes of Bob, but he's a regular guy who becomes the hero, which is a common theme in literature and TV. Different from the theme, but related to the theme of the regular guy who is the superhero, a regular woman who becomes the superhero.
Right.
And again,
and
you know,
the whole hero's journey.
Yeah.
And has to make a decision and use his skills in a particular way. And use them for good. You know, how do we choose to use them for good? And yeah, Bob is one of my favorite characters.
Yes.
I gave it away.
Bob died? What else you did give away? The Rosebud is a sled? What else?
I know.
So a few other things about this episode. There is the Chicago connection. So this episode takes place in Chicago. Where have we seen Chicago referenced elsewhere in the show, especially this season?
Indianapolis is what I always think of with the reference in the show. They always talk about Indianapolis in my brain. I don't remember.
No, I don't either. Feels like we've been quizzed.
The character of Murray lives in Chicago. He used to be a reporter for the Chicago Times. And
Chicago Times.
Yeah, because they do go to Illinois, don't they, when they go to see Murray?
Yes. And so Jonathan and Nancy, at about the same time that 11 is in Chicago, they're in Chicago themselves because they're visiting with Murray. And then early on, I think it's the first episode of this season, it's mentioned that Joyce has taken Will to Chicago for some medical tests.
Mhm.
So Chicago keeps coming back. You mentioned names here and how, of course, Eleven's actual name, given name, is Jane.
Mhm.
Kali seems to have chosen her name, though.
Well, Kali in the Hindu pantheon is a goddess of destruction.
Yes.
Violence.
And transformation. Yes.
Transformation.
Mhm.
So
And-
I don't think that she would have been given that name so much as chosen it for herself.
We're not quite sure though, are we?
It might be a shortening of an Indian name,
Yeah,
Kalinda.
because she was taken
Yes.
as a child where she was actually old enough to have known her name.
Mhm.
And
That's a good point.
So we don't know for sure because her name could be shortened to Callie, but the goddess Callie is actually a beautiful pairing for her
Yeah.
personality at that
Yes.
time
Yeah,
and the empowerment that she has.
Yeah.
She is a fierce young woman.
exactly. And Kali, the character, has the potential for huge destructiveness, but also for transformation.
Yes.
And I think she is the goddess that is capable of pretty much all.
Mhm.
I mean, she has like unbelievable power, which I think is exactly going back to that X-Men concept of mastermind. She can create, she can
Mhm.
destroy, she can recreate.
Yes.
And one of the things that I loved in this was the set design. And I loved seeing again, going to Cali. And I always think of like my first teacher was from India and I always wore bindi.
Mhm.
And she would come to class and she would sometimes babysit me. And this was when I was in preschool. I went to Montessori school for preschool and she had her bindi on. So thinking of the third eye,
Mm.
that they had the spiritualizer sign.
Mhm.
It was spiritual advisor, but
Spiritual advisor, yes. But the
he's
part of it is burned out. Yes.
and with the third eye there on it, which I always thought was spectacular nod at that point in time
Yes.
in this particular episode, because every time you see it is when she and Elle are talking and you have this way of seeing
Mhm.
with the third eye.
Mhm.
Yes. But that sign is usually behind L.
Mm-hmm.
So who's the spiritual advisor in this situation?
And again, going to that same
Mhm.
issue of who is the lost sister.
Yeah, I think
right?
it goes both ways.
Mm-hmm. You can't have one without the other.
Yeah.
You have no sister then, right?
Yes. And so speaking of those background details, there's a lot of graffiti in this episode. I know I did not catch it all.
Mhm.
But and in fact, you mentioned that there's a few things that you saw that I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Such as?
The ones that I saw were, of course, when Elle first comes in to the warehouse, there is a black 8 ball behind her. And of course, Mama sees Channel 8
Yes.
and Spinning 8. But you have that black 8 ball, which I thought was spectacular because we all know the stories about the black 8 ball. And, when you're like, I'm behind
Mhm.
the 8 ball,
Mhm.
and that if you sink it too early,
Yeah.
you'll lose.
Yeah.
And there's also the Magic 8 Ball, of course.
Yes. Which is a sort of spiritual advisor in itself.
Mm-hmm. But it also reappears in season 4. You actually have
Yes, an actual
Magic 8 Ball.
Oh,
in the rainbow
okay.
room.
I haven't
and
rewatched it yet, so I'm gonna have to go back for that.
Yeah, rewatch that because I remember like I've always loved Magic 8 Balls. That was like one of the toys my aunts and I played with all the time. But yeah, I love that. And of course, you have Royal with the crown, all of these amazing moments of like some great, like little tiny pieces. He had Lola out there and really some hinting at some of the other characters' possible pasts
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
and their experiences. Because as we know from our family that Dottie and Mick are both women and that we are kind of not sure exactly what caused them to run away, but I will leave the other ones to you because I know that you had quite a few that you also saw.
Yeah, I listed a bunch of them. So King Mob is featured fairly prominently. Either of you get that reference?
Yeah, in 18th and 19th century discourse, King Mob, coming back to moral panics, was the fear that the mob would rise up and overthrow the ruling elite and just replace the order with chaos, reflecting the fear of the French Revolution, for example. So that was a common phrase used in the 19th century.
Yes. And I had to do a little bit of research on that because that was more, I think, British centric than American. But there is a comic book character created by Grant Morrison named King Mob, who was a psychic terrorist. So I think that's part of the connection there too. But yeah, that idea of the sort of proletariat rising up to destroy the elites of the ruling class, you kind of get that referenced in Callie and her crew.
Yeah.
Oh, Bedlam is another one that's featured.
Yeah, again, the outcast, right?
Yeah.
With Bedlam as well. And also hearing, if I remember right, it was Dottie who had just gotten out of the assignment.
Yes. So
And
yeah,
Bedlam,
for listeners who don't know, Bedlam is a reference to an insane asylum, I believe in London, although I'm not.
London, yes, originally called the Bethlehem Hospital,
Yes.
and it transported into Bedlam.
Yes.
yeah.
And the metaphorical meaning of Bedlam, beyond the literal meaning of madness, is all hell breaks loose, which we are seeing in this episode, potentially coming back to the King Mob reference of overturning, and the outcast people are taking justice into their own hands.
Yes. Lola, as you referenced, what does that mean to you, Lola?
Well, Lola is a young girl, young woman, young adult, not quite an adult yet, who is sexualized. And her sexualization is like sunning herself in her bikini and sucking on a sucker, that somehow that is a sexual interpretation of who she is. I think Lola is, this very much this young woman who is just starting to become aware of her own sexuality, but that men often go after and think that they're way more experienced and wanting things that they don't necessarily always want.
I didn't make that connection. Nabokov's Lolita, which means little Lola.
Yeah, to me, this is absolutely that concept, of Lola, because I think Lolita, the name is Lola.
Yeah.
And, but you have like this, you have all of these young women who are coming of age in this group.
Yeah.
We have that Gen X role, and I think Runaway, again, going back to that concept of Bon Jovi, you have this sexualization of emerging young adults who are sexualized and often have very little choice or say within so much of what is happening and what is being projected upon them.
Yes. Now, for me, Lola always makes me think of the Kinks song, Lola.
Yes.
And that's the only thing that comes to my mind, really. So I wasn't thinking like Lolita. But, Lola in the song is someone who is kind of sexually ambiguous or androgynous. And, of course, 11 was seen as androgynous in the first season. And even to some extent in this season as well, because she does wear boys' clothes for the most part.
Well, as a young woman, I always, as a kid, I wore boys' clothes and I had pixie haircuts all the time because my hair was super thick, and my mom was like, I always kept it cut really short because she just couldn't handle it because it was so thick. And so I was often mistaken as a boy until I started developing, and I loved it, especially with my nickname Ken, right? And I thought it was like the best thing ever. And then all of a sudden, when you're 10 years old, 11 years old, and men start hitting on you, it's like really disappointing and sad.
You.
Well, it's true. I mean, ask it. This is really, really common. And so, I think with Lola, you have, again, this outsider storyline of what kind of relationship and what kind of love and what kind of a family will be recognized, and what
Mhm.
won't. And I think we see that very much of that time period.
There's also a song, Whatever Lola Wants,
Lola
Lola
Gets.
Gets.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
Sexualizing of the woman,
Mhm.
this time sexually predatory woman.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's because she's using the system that is forced upon her,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So you have this system, and then she's using it, and she's like, whatever Lola wants, Lola gets, and that's what's going to happen. And I think, yeah, I didn't even think of that one either. Yeah.
Interesting.
But I think Lola is very loaded.
Yes. And that's the thing with the graffiti here. I'm sure there's a lot of meaning behind it, which I'm not necessarily getting. So, like, salve is another one.
Mm-hmm.
Greetings.
Yeah.
The Latin word for greeting, of greeting.
Mm-hmm. And you also saw at one point in time the train behind L, like a little spray painted train, train cars. I think it's 2 cars.
Yeah.
And then you have, obviously all the numbers.
Yeah.
Yes. So 6 is referenced, and then you get the Roman numeral 3.
Yeah.
Janus is also part of the graffiti. Janus being another name for Jane.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think of Janis Joplin again, very
spelled differently, but yes.
But yeah, I think also like as a woman, again, music, the music importance of music, but also like a woman who maybe I never think of Janis Joplin as particularly feminine, and I mean she's feminine, but not in the same way as like sexualized in the same way as like Pat Benatar or something.
Right.
I kind of think of like the same way as like I think Joan Jett has really pushed back on like the sexualization aspect, and I think Janis Joplin did the same kind of thing. So yeah, Janis, you're right, Jane.
Yeah.
And you have No One, right?
No One, which I'm not sure exactly what that means. I have an idea.
It's a number. It's also
it is.
It's No One. We meet again. Spoilers. Number 1 in season 4.
Yes,
is this a foreshadowing?
And no is an abbreviation of number.
Number 1.
So number 1. And so, yeah, that was my thinking, is that it was the foreshadowing for season 4 meeting number 1. And if I remember, and again, I've only seen season 4 once, someone says that there is no number 1, or there was no number 1. So yeah, no one. Okay.
But I think you also have, as people who are misfits in society, you're no one.
Right. Oh, that's a good point.
And I think, you have like the invisible man, right? The concept in literature,
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So again, thinking of Sunshine, maybe.
And Callie's trick of making the police not see her and her band is a form of invisibility. She's projecting it into their minds, but it still makes them invisible.
OPT is featured, and I don't know what that means. I mean, as a word, it's opt, which means to choose. So maybe that's a connection, but it seems like it's more of an abbreviation or an acronym, and I don't know what for. And then Live Fast is probably the last bit of graffiti before they flee.
Well, that invites the completion of the phrase "Live fast, die young."
Die young, yep.
But also, if you're opting, again, to that discussion that you have between Callie and Jane /L/11, that you have to make a choice. Do you opt in or do you opt out?
And I think that makes sense. And then the idea of festering is referenced a few times, and it has to be explained to 11 what it means, to spread or to rot. And of course, we've seen that earlier in season 2 with the upside down spreading into the world of Hawkins and rotting the ground and the pumpkins.
Absolutely, where you have this aspect of festering, of death, of rot, starting with the pumpkins, right?
Yes.
And then the trees and so forth.
And in season 3, we see how creatures of the Upside Down are able to reassemble themselves through essentially dead flesh.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think too, it is very much as we move into season 4, we see what festering for multiple seasons has done.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And the anger that can happen underneath. But I think it was interesting because the definition that Callie gives is not the same definition as Callie's representation of Papa in
Yes.
gives.
Mhm.
And Papa gives the definition of rot,
Yes.
and Callie does not. And I think we can also see a difference between, and this has been one of my own personal little pet peeves, is that Elle's communication skills, her English grammar changes and gets where all of a sudden now she's using prepositions and she's using verbs more frequently in season 2 and season 3, and then all of a sudden it reverts back when she moves to California in season 4. But I think, part of you wonders, like, is it an emotional aspect that's affecting her language, or is this something that's going on with the storytelling? But it's one of those things, I think, with the festering aspect is that I think the choice that you see again with 8 and 11 is who's letting this fester and who's not.
That's a good point.
Even though 8 says, you have to get it out, you have to work it out of your system so that it's not festering.
Mm-hmm.
And that her Yoda aspect is like, to focus through anger.
Yes.
And Callie's obsession with revenge arguably is the festering, is the failure to move beyond her trauma.
And I think that, again, is kind of going to this Gen X concept, right? That I love that, our phrase for our generation that so many other generations kind of look at and is like, define us by is like, whatever.
Whatever.
Yeah.
Festering is like, I think so much of like Gen X, we had to like figure shit out, and we had to figure shit out a lot of times on our own. And I think our whatever is kind of like letting it go.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's like whatever, and life goes on, and I got to move past it and do my things. But I think that festering aspect, I think that's just part of teenage years, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, being a teenager is hard. Being a young adult is hard. It doesn't get easier, you just get more used to it, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say something like that. Yeah, being an adult is hard.
Yeah, but we
Just
have
adulting is hard.
We have coffee. Coffee makes things better. You don't get coffee at age 10 or 11. But yeah, I think that festering concept, I think, is, again, which sister is letting it fester.
Yes. Another idea that comes back around is numerology. And we've seen this several times in the second season, how numbers have meaning. So in this case, we see that Mama's watching Channel 8, which obviously transitions into number 8 or Callie. They're listening to a police scanner, and the officer says, this is car 13, responding to a 245 at 31 Ashbury. 245, you add those numbers together, it's 11. And then 13 and 31, you add those numbers together, and it's 8. Interestingly, a 245 in the Los Angeles police code is assault with a deadly weapon, which foreshadows what happens in this episode. We also get a reference to 327. That's when 11 says how long she was with Hopper was 327 days. And I don't know what that number means because it adds up to 12. So I'm not sure what's going on there. But, 12, 2 plus 1 is 3. And we do see a reference to the number 3 in the graffiti. So I don't know if that's foreshadowing what comes later on. Who is number 3? Do we meet number 3 or number 12? I don't know.
Well, I think 8 and 11 are both very symmetrical, right? So I'm going to go back to my Schoolhouse Rock and talk about 8 on its side is infinity,
Mm-hmm.
and that 8 is like considered this number of balance, right? Physically, the layout of it is
Mm-hmm.
one of proportionate balance.
Yep.
Two circles on top of each other.
2 zeros.
Yeah. And so we have, again, that aspect of infinity goes on and on. So the question of morality, a question of how do we respond to things that happen to us? How do we carry this forward? And I think these are infinite questions that we deal with as adults. But I also think 11 is this other beautifully balanced number.
Yep.
We have 2 ones next to each other, right?
Reflecting each other. And we talked about that in the first season, how 11 is sort of balance or reflection of will.
Mm-hmm.
And how in the first season, there's a lot of sort of parallels between characters there.
And again, this mirroring. So 8 is a mirroring, 11 is a mirroring. But you also have 8 is very divisible and 11 is prime.
Yes.
And the whole show is about mirror image, mirror worlds.
Yes,
worlds.
very much so. Few allusions in here. So Shirley Temple is referenced several times. It's what Axel calls 11. Who is Shirley Temple? I'm not sure our listeners will know the reference there.
Oh, that people don't know who she is. She is a child star in the Interwarriors film singing stuff, most famous for the good ship Lollipop. And she had these blonde curls, and the reference to Elle as Shirley Temple is a reference to the curls that she's and I think it's fascinating how Elle's hairstyle changes. You first meet her shaven-headed, and she has the curls when she goes to Chicago. Then she comes back with a kind of gothy look and hair slicked back. And when you see her at the Snowball, she's more stereotypically feminine, sort of long hairdo.
And I think too, it's great because my grandmother used to tie my mother's hair up in rags to make them Shirley Temple curls. Definitely, she is a silent generation actress.
Yeah, she was also the American ambassador to Czechoslovakia at the time of the Velvet Revolution. Not sure if there's any significance there. Perhaps
that's what I was going to say. In the 80s, she was an ambassador. So
Shirley Temple is this like amazing woman who just like did these things that you would not expect. So I mean, again, you have this aspect of power, I think, in connection to Shirley Temple too. At least in my brain, it definitely connects to that aspect of like hidden powers, hidden skills, and things that are going to come out of Elle or Shirley Temple that you would not expect.
So Shirley Temple, I think, is one of those references that kind of goes over the heads of younger generations, and so that one needed to be explained.
Drink a Shirley Temple too.
Oh yeah.
And if you don't know what it's made out of, 7-Up and maraschino cherry juice. It's a kiddie cocktail.
Yes, it is.
Which is something that we also grew up with Gen Xers. You had kiddie cocktails. Let's start you early.
That's right.
Can't give you the alcohol, but we'll give you everything but.
Right. Just to prepare you, We get a visual reference to Care Bears because the mask that Funshine wears is that of a Care Bear, which I think makes sense because Callie says he's really a teddy bear.
Yeah. And his name is Funshine.
Oh, I didn't think about that.
And I think you also have then the Care Bears. Rainbows come out of Care Bears.
Yes, that is true.
So,
and then we get a clip of Punky Brewster on TV. Either of you remember Punky Brewster?
I don't think that made it over to the UK.
I was a little old for Punky Brewster because I am like right between grade wise. I'm closer to like age wise. I'm like only a year older, but I was one of the youngest in my class and actually could have ended up being moved ahead. But thankfully, my parents said no because I should not have started college at 16. But being one of the younger ones, I'm right between the older group and the younger group in this particular series. So I was like right smack in the middle. Punky Brewster's a little young for me, but Punky Brewster was, again, kind of like, I can't remember if she was an orphan, but she also, like, I think ran away at one point in time. But I think it's really appropriate that Ray is watching this and wanting to watch the story of Punky Brewster, despite his own past.
Right.
And he has 2 daughters, as we find out in the episode, but also we have the things that he did. We had that flashback moment of him zapping 8 and with the stick, like, she's a cow. We have like Punky Brewster having this nightmare about a needle that's growing and growing and growing, and very much the lab experience of these 2 young women and the way they were treated. And I think that is such a very appropriate moment in time for them to come in on.
And as you say, Punky Brewster was an orphan who was taken in by an older man and became a sort of foster father for her, similar to 11 and Hopper.
But we also have, like, at that time period, thinking of the Lost Sister. That was like a really common motif of TV shows at that point in time, right? So you had a lot of orphaned kids being taken in. You had Silver Spoon, you had
Different Strokes.
You had Punky Brewster. All of these different kinds of shows with like kids that were being taken in, again, by white men to live middle class lives.
And it kind of circles back to our Latchkey
wealthy kids
idea with which we began the conversation. Is it's reflecting the Latchkey kid generation, but kind of judgmentally, not saying the Latchkey kid experience is legitimate, but saying these kids need a father figure. They need a family,
because the mothers are just abandoning them, right?
Notice that they're never adopted in by a mother, except for the school. The one, oh my gosh, I'm blanking.
Facts
what
of
is
Life.
it? Thank you. Thank you. I was thinking Joe. Facts of Life, where it's like you have the mother figure there.
Which was a spinoff of Different Strokes.
Exactly. So, but you have, again, this, like, if you take your children away from their father, how dare you?
Of course, BoJack Horseman parodies that genre of show, the adult and the orphans.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, if you're a BoJack Horseman fan, you'll understand that reference.
So those are the things that I saw. Is there anything else that you caught?
I really just noticed like the Pat Benatar thing. And I will just say this, it just screams at me. But I do think it's really interesting that in the last episode of this particular season 2, that they finally do use Pat Benatar and Love is a Battlefield and You Want to Do Jazz Hands. That Pat Benatar is at the beginning of the Snowball and Love is a Battlefield, which I think also is very appropriate for what Callie and Elle are going through with their relationships and the stressed family relationships aspect of this. But it starts off instead at the Snowball. Maybe a nod back to where they were.
Okay, so any other points you want to add?
No, not things that would go in this particular episode. But again, that Snowball set of music, super awesome, and connection and relationship, I think, to the set of music that we're talking about here.
Okay.
But
so something to look forward to.
Absolutely. Something to look forward to, and not very long after this.
Yes, that's a good point. We're very close to the end of this season. So the homework for next time is to watch The Mind Flayer, which is chapter 8. And again, I think the producers missed the opportunity to make this chapter 8 because it would have been an obvious connection with 8. But for next time, it's The Mind Flayer. The shadow monster finally gets a name. And of course, it's harkening back to D&D again.
Yeah, and let's say we can't call him no one, so he's got to have a name.
Yes.
Yeah, The Mind Flayer.
So look forward to that.
Thank you for having us on the show, Vince. We appreciate it.
Thanks for joining. I'm going to expect you to come back at some point.
Absolutely.
I'll be happy to talk about Kate Bush and
British
creators music.
Yes, looking forward to that.
Again, another spoiler. Kate Bush features heavily.
I don't know if that's so much a spoiler since that was such a cultural phenomenon at the time. I think that most people are aware of it.
Absolutely. I think of Killer Mike every time I think of Kate Bush now.
Okay, so thanks for listening. Take it easy, take care, and stay strange. Stranger Things in the 1980s is produced by Dread Pirate Productions. Cover art is by Sherry Archer. The theme music is Cobalt by Alex Bloxam, used under license from Filmstro. You can support this podcast, ask questions, or give topic suggestions by going to patreon.com/Stranger Things in the 1980s.